Well, hi everyone, and welcome to Chapter 5, the Language and Religion lesson of GEO102, Human Geography. I'm Professor Rios, and language and religion, two things that are like super significant in culture. They just are some of the most significant aspects of culture, even if you're not a particularly religious individual and you may not practice a particular religion, it may still play a significant role in your life. Of course, language, and that gets into things like dialects and accents and that kind of thing. This image right here is the Buddha in Kamakura, Japan. Very distinctive iconography of that region. And so we'll get into that the second half of the lesson. So first, the geography of language, okay? And so this is, so far in the world, it's about 7,100 languages. And that gives you a sense of how many are spoken in Europe versus Africa, Asia, and so on. Lots and lots and lots of languages. Many of them don't have a writing component. Okay, so this is how it's broken down as of 2018, the number of speakers and the total countries spoken. Chinese, not surprisingly, it's the most spoken language in the world. English is not that far behind, but English is spoken in many more countries than is, say, Chinese. But Chinese is simply spoken a lot as a function of numbers, and that's just Mandarin. There's, of course, Cantonese in the southeast part of China, in what we call Hong Kong, which is a totally different language, essentially, altogether. And there you have Spanish, English, Arabic, and so on. And that's as of 2018. Classification of languages, we'll get into that. We'll talk about the idea of a proto language, an ancestral tongue, and for example, English comes from Old German, and Yiddish comes from Old German. That language that the Hasidic Jews in Kiryas Joel and in Monsey speak. So that language, along with English, what we call English, whether that be American English or Her Majesty's English in the UK, comes from, has a Germanic root. And if you actually heard Old English spoken, you probably wouldn't understand it. So it's an amazing richness in the variety of languages that are found out there. So now here's sort of the idea of the Indo-European tree of languages. Notice Germanic, and you go to East, North, and West Germanic, which is broken up into High and Low German, which is broken into German and Yiddish on one end, and then on the other end, you have Old Anglo-Saxon, Middle English, Modern English. This is what we speak. But notice how Middle and Low German, Middle Dutch, Flemish, there's a lot of languages that sort of share that same sort of root, as it were. Now, if you speak Spanish, if you speak Portuguese, if you speak French or Italian, Italic, broken down into Latin, and then eventually what we call the Romantic languages: Romanian, Catalan, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, Provence or Provençal, and French. And Provence is a region of France, which is in this whole sort of Mediterranean coastal Europe. So that area right there. As someone who speaks Spanish, I can tell you that I went to Barcelona and could not understand Catalan. It's a totally different language to me. However, I can understand Italian pretty well, even if I can't speak it. As long as an Italian person speaks slowly enough, I can follow it. So it's an interesting way of looking at it. And you might be the same. If you have an Italian background, maybe you understand Spanish, and so on. So now what we call Celtic So Welsh, Gaelic, Irish versus Slavic, and so on. So it's an interesting, languages are fascinating, and the more you know, the better. So if you're taking a language, I highly encourage you to stick with it. Okay, so how languages spread, of course, colonialism brought Spanish to what we call Latin America now. And where in the West do you speak French or Spanish or Portuguese? Has everything to do with where those colonial powers were in power. All right. The idea of spread, it's usually what's called hierarchical spreading. So that's, sort of top down. So as a result of what's called societal and status standing really made a significant impact in how that language spread. However, English has a very high status across the world. So in many places, learning English, it doesn't matter what your native language is significant. Another way, expansion, diffusion, and those are the actual, the partial or total acculturation of the adopted population, and that language will spread and it will morph. Okay, English in the U.S. has that form. When you think about the different accents and the different dialects of American English in the U.S. versus Australia versus New Zealand versus, of course, the United Kingdom. Okay. Here's the effect of colonialism, where French, Portuguese, English, and Spanish were of significance. Okay. And in a place like Liberia, settled by freed American slaves, in it you see the effect of, think about the idea of Robertsport, English name, Monrovia, the capital, named after President Monroe of the United States, Buchanan, Riversess, and then you go inland and the names are a little bit more native African. This is how the languages are spread across the world, and that just, you can take a look at this on your own as you look through the ebook, but it gives you a sense of the sort of the breakdown, the geographical spread of different language families. Here's an example, Cameroon, and this is one country in Africa. And I only showed you this to show you how complex the pattern of languages can be. So a lot of these languages are considered tribal languages, meaning they're spoken very, very, very locally. And so from tribe to tribe, it might be completely different language. Language per Twitter. So Twitter feeds and the languages used. So it's not just English, believe it or not. We'll talk about the idea of English, and English where it's spoken as a native tongue, where it is spoken as an official language, a second language, a pidgin. And a pidgin is basically like a hybrid language or Creole. And then, of course, the non-English world. Okay. So we'll talk about these right there. Pidgin and a Creole. A pidgin and a Creole is an amalgam, which means it's like a hodgepodge of different languages sort of fused together into one. I would say that if you are Puerto Rican or if you are Dominican, you probably speak Spanglish. And if you know what Spanglish is, then you speak it. I speak Spanglish. It's a very weird, cumbersome, annoying sometimes way of speaking because you go in and out of English and Spanish and you mix words and you hybridize them. I do it all the time. My almost 90-year-old mother now does it all the time. It's just the way it happens. And if you are of Latin American background, you may do it as well. And you may not even realize that you do it. It's also a simplified form of a language. Okay, lingua franca is basically a language that has been adopted as a language of commerce. English often serves this purpose. Okay, so English is often what considered a lingua franca in many parts of the world. It's sort of the language of trade and the language of commerce, and it's a language that a lot of people sort of rely on for really everything in their lives outside of home life, say. Okay. Soft drinks, I may have gone over this image on at the beginning of the semester, but it's a way of looking at language through what you call a soft drink. Here in the Northeast, we call it soda, almost exclusively. However, if you're from many other parts of the country, you call it pop, P-O-P. And if you go to Texas or the South, you call it Coke. It doesn't matter if you're asking for a Pepsi. If you want a Pepsi, that's the kind of Coke you want. That's just simply a naming convention that's sort of given, okay? So notice how I think I may have mentioned in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, where you have a lot of people from the Northeast and a lot of people from the Midwest. It's sort of this weird, hard to tell a pattern there because it's so jumbled together, okay? But you definitely get to see some interesting patterns emerge. Of course, you know, in Quebec, so the idea of, the language of Quebec, which is French, even though officially the rest of Canada is more English Canada. The Queen of England is in Canada's money, and the Queen of England is still the head of state of Canada, believe it or not. She is considered the head of state. They are part of the Commonwealth. Yet there is a very distinctive French part of Canada called Quebec. And this right here, je me souviens, and I may be totally mispronouncing that, but that means I remember. And what do they remember? They remember that they are French. So there you go. Of course, you have Spain, and Spain is not as homogeneous as you would think. Spain is made up of course, Catalan, which is right here, Catalunya, which has a capital of Barcelona. You have the Basque region with a capital Bilbao, and they have a very different looking flag, and they do not consider Spain to be their country. They consider themselves to be Basque. And of course, you have the rest of Castellana or Castilian Spain, which would be the rest of Spain. Okay. Let's see, religion. So I took this photo. Isn't it cool? I think it's the best photo I've ever taken. It was taken in a church in Jerusalem. And it's pretty cool. Anyway, enough bragging. So the geography of religion, these are the adherents as of, I believe it's 2018. I'm sorry, 1945 to 2010, but it's still the most recent image that your book has. And there's a number of adherents. Christianity, Islam are the two big ones, and Hinduism. Islam is the fastest growing religion, and that has everything to do with reproduction and fertility rates in countries where Islam is practiced. Okay. This right here is a map of Lutherans in the United States. Notice Scandinavian people who settled in Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa. This is Mormons. Mormonism, by the way, a religion which began near Palmyra, New York. The Mormons eventually were pushed out of what was then the U.S. into what was then Mexico. And then once the U.S. basically took over that region, they settled the state of Utah. And that's why Utah is more than 50% Mormon, in many cases more than 75% Mormon per county. Okay. This is Muslims in the US, more of an urban breakdown. This is Jewish. Notice Rockland County, Orange County, Sullivan County, Ocean County in New Jersey, New York County, and Queens. Also a more significant, or maybe less significant than Muslims, but still a more urban pattern, or near universities and colleges. Okay. Of course, these are Christians broken down by whether it be Baptist, Assemblies of God, Presbyterian, United Church of Christ, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Episcopalian, and it's Lutheran, Missouri, and the other flavor of the evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So there's like two different types. But there you get to see you get a chance to see the different, the breakdown. And when you look at a place like in Texas, where you had these two blue dots, those would be Lutheran churches, big German populations in this part of Texas. Okay, the importance of religion, it's fundamental because it's a fundamental component of culture, central to landscapes, that has political impacts right now, whether it be 2020 or beyond. It's going to be a part of elections from here on out, period. Can't get away from it. And it's not going to change. Health implications and practices, and of course, it has its own geography. So we'll talk about the idea of places and routes, the importance, whether it be Bethlehem or Jerusalem or Muslim Africa versus Christian tribal Africa. Okay, think about how it affects us in our daily lives, the work week, Sunday, the Sabbath, which is Saturday, food and dietary laws, expressions, morals and ethics, entertainment, dress, architecture, and of course, the news. Can't get away from it. It's always going to be there. The different types of religion, some of them are monotheistic, they believe in one God. Polytheistic, they believe in many. And you tend to have universalizing religions. They claim applicability to everybody. You can be black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Latino, tall, skinny, fat, short, blue-eyed, black-eyed, long hair, short hair, bald. It doesn't matter. You can be a Christian, a Muslim, or a Buddhist. An ethnic religion is a religion you're born into. And then, so those are the two big ones that I want to sort of focus on. So universalizing religions, there you see, they basically evangelize. Ethnic religions, slow growth. The most obvious one in our area would be Judaism. And tribal religions, which tend to be very, very small and regionally concentrated, locally concentrated. And they usually tend to be absorbed by some of the larger religions. And here's the pattern across the world. So you're talking about patterns and flow, the diffusion, and here's the diffusion of major religions across the world, whether it be Christianity in that sort of lighter blue, Islam in the darker blue, Buddhism in the green, and Hinduism in the black. Okay, so I'm going to leave it here. I'm going to let you go and look at individual religions that's found within your text. Again, I highly recommend that you sort of pay attention to this, because religion and language are two of the most fundamental aspects of culture today, and they have an impact later on. They have an impact in what we call popular versus folk culture. So please pay attention to that. If you have any questions, of course, send me an email and we can set up a Zoom study hour if needed. So thank you very much. I hope you have a great week and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.